Section Objectives. During this lesson, we will discuss the following topics: engineering controls, respiratory protection, safe work practices, and drilling. Introduction. Now that you understand the hazards of exposure to hydrogen sulfide, you should also realize the importance of taking protective measures when working in areas where hydrogen sulfide may be present. As you know, the maximum safe exposure to hydrogen sulfide is 10 parts per million. The best way to avoid being poisoned by hydrogen sulfide is to avoid being exposed to it in the first place. In most cases, this can be accomplished through the use of engineering controls. Of course, when it is not possible to reduce exposure below potentially harmful levels, respirators are an absolute necessity. Hydrogen sulfide may be present. As you know, the maximum safe exposure to hydrogen sulfide is 10 parts per million. The best way to avoid being poisoned by hydrogen sulfide is to avoid being exposed to it in the first place. In most cases, this can be accomplished through the use of engineering controls. Of course, when it is not possible to reduce exposure below potentially harmful levels, respirators are an absolute necessity. Administrative controls. Administrative controls or work practice controls are changes in work procedures, such as written safety policies, rules, supervision, schedules, and training, with the goal of reducing the duration, frequency, and severity of exposure to hazardous chemicals or situations. An example would be to provide training, such as this course, that improves an employee's understanding of the hazards of hydrogen sulfide exposure. Another example would be adjusting schedules so that employees are not in areas that produce hydrogen sulfide when elevated concentrations are expected. Engineering controls. Engineering controls are controls placed on the working environment that limit the possibility of exposure to hazards. The two most common engineering controls used to remove hydrogen sulfide from the work environment are containment and ventilation. Containment and ventilation. Containment is one of the most frequently used means of isolating hydrogen sulfide. Containment prevents the gas from entering the breathable air by containing it within a closed piping system. Ventilation is another effective means of reducing the hydrogen sulfide concentration in work areas. Slight, steady breezes can be enough to significantly reduce concentrations. This can be accomplished naturally by keeping a clear, open work area to allow air to circulate, or it can be assisted by the use of fans. When using ventilation, it is important to keep upwind of the areas where hydrogen sulfide is released. Section. When administrative and engineering controls are not sufficient to keep hydrogen sulfide concentrations below 10 ppm due to economical or technological limitations, respiratory protection is required. The self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA, is the only acceptable form of respiratory protection used in the presence of hydrogen sulfide. This device supplies compressed, breathable air from a cylinder to a face mask via a breathing tube. Depending on the type of SCBA, these cylinders can be either carried by the user or remain in a fixed location and attached to the user's face mask by a hose. Types of SCBAs. There are several types of SCBAs available to employees working around hydrogen sulfide, each with its own purpose and limitations. These are escape unit, hose line work unit, and work rescue unit. Let's take a closer look at each of these SCBA types. Units are small, light SCBAs carried by employees who work in areas where hydrogen sulfide might be detected. The units, due to their small capacity, are worn only when hazardous levels of hydrogen sulfide are detected. Most of these units have cylinders that contain just 5 minutes of air. These units serve a single purpose: to provide enough oxygen to allow the worker to escape the hazardous area. These SCBAs should not be used to perform rescue operations or complete work. Hose line work unit. Hose line work units are SCBAs provided to workers performing work in the presence of hydrogen sulfide for long periods of time. The hose line work unit provides two sources of air. The primary source of air is a cylinder connected to a face mask by a hose, which allows the worker to move to the work area without having to carry the cylinder. A smaller backup cylinder is carried by the worker. The second cylinder is generally used as an escape unit when the primary source of air expires. Work Rescue Unit. A work rescue unit is a 30-minute ensemble used by workers who need to perform rescues or who work in areas where remote sources of air are not available. These SCBAs should be readily accessible and spread throughout an area where workers may be exposed to H2S. These cylinders do not tend to last the full 30 minutes, since the duration is based upon ideal conditions. Normally, the air in a work rescue unit will allow workers to perform their duties for just over 20 minutes. When the cylinder reaches 25% capacity, a low alarm will sound. When this occurs, the workers must leave the hazardous area immediately. Requirements. Before you can use an SCBA, you must undergo a medical evaluation and fit testing. If you are expected to use an SCBA at any time on your work site, your employer is required by OSHA, API, and other international regulatory standards to ensure that you know how to use the SCBA properly. SCBA training should teach you how to inspect the SCBA, don and doff the SCBA, and act during emergency procedures. Each of these training aspects should be reinforced through regular drills, which we will discuss later in this section. Practices. Safe work practices are documented, standardized procedures developed to ensure that potentially hazardous tasks can be performed safely. It is important to follow these safe work practices. Follow the safety plans and policies of the contingency plan. Work upwind of hydrogen sulfide sources. Use the buddy system, and prevent sparks. We will discuss the contingency plan in a separate section. For now, let's look at the remaining three elements of safe work practices. Working upwind of H2S sources. As stated when we discussed ventilation as an engineering control, it is important to work upwind of hydrogen sulfide sources to reduce the likelihood of exposure to the toxic gas. Working downwind will put you in the path of the hydrogen sulfide as it moves with the wind. Wind direction can be determined with the assistance of flags and windsocks. Buddy system. A worker using the buddy system has another worker assigned to watch over them while they enter a hazardous area. Being apart from the work hazard allows this buddy to observe the work from a safe distance and to signal for help in case of an emergency. Preventing sparks. Because hydrogen sulfide is flammable and can be ignited at very low concentrations, care should be taken not to create sparks that may ignite the gas. Electrical equipment used when atmospheric concentrations of hydrogen sulfide are greater than 10% of the lower explosive limit, LEL, should be intrinsically safe or explosion-proof. Tools used in this volatile atmosphere should be made of non-sparking material, such as brass or copper beryllium alloy. Drilling. Drills that require use of an SCBA should be performed on a regular basis to ensure you know how to use the SCBA in an emergency, as well as to ensure you know your overall responsibilities during the emergency. During drills, you should don the appropriate breathing equipment depending on your responsibilities as determined by the contingency plan. Workers should also perform routine work for a short time while wearing the SCBA in order to acclimate themselves to using it. Following a drill, the SCBA cylinder should be refilled, inspected, and made ready for use in any future emergencies.